Welcome to Economics Happy Hour. My name's Matt.
And my name is Jadrian.
And our third person's name is?
I'm Brian. It's got to
Hey,
be
thanks
Brian,
for joining
right?
us again, Brian.
One of the Bryans.
One of the,
Yeah. Yeah. Thrilled to have Brian O'Rourke back with us today. He pitched the topic, which we will reveal in a moment, although you're listening to this, so you've seen the title. So it's about higher interest rates. We figured, yeah, we'll talk about it. Come join us. And Brian, thankfully, thank you for saying yes.
That's a pleasure. This is one of those topics that the longer I've taught, the more I learned about this and the more excited I get when I talk about monetary policy, which I never thought would happen when I came out of grad school. I thought, oh, please don't ever let me teach macro. And I love this stuff now. This is really exciting.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And Brian, you just finished up your last day of the semester. We're recording this in late April. Jadrian, do you have another week left?
I've got teaching days. I have 2, and then a final exam next week. So I'm close.
Yeah. Susquehanna's schedule goes until a week from Monday. I am not teaching this semester, so I guess I have 0 teaching days this semester left. But the work commencement, it'll slow down a little bit here. And then the important thing, what are you both drinking today?
I'll go first. I pulled one deep out of the back of the fridge for this one. I have some summer beers, summer/spring beers that I'm saving to drink outside. And since I'm drinking inside, I grabbed a cold back of the fridge winter beer from Matt's favorite brewery, the Rusty Rail. I'll show just a little bit of it. Rusty Rail Brewery.
Rail.
Yeah, that shows you how deep in the back of this fridge. Because Matt's like he hasn't been to Pennsylvania in a while. It is the Moose Snacks Peanut Butter Fudge Golden Stout. So back of the fridge winter beer is what we're having today.
Yeah.
Brian, that was half smile, half cringe. I'm guessing that is not your style.
He's not a dark beer fan, so it's
Not a dark beer and no peanut butter or whatever that is.
peanut butter fudge.
Yikes.
What is your beer today?
Oh, I'm not drinking beer.
Not beer. What is the drink?
But since we're talking about higher for longer, I made a Long Island iced tea.
Ooh.
So
Okay.
a lot of ice in this, but thought it fit the theme for today. I haven't had a Long Island iced tea in a long time, and tomorrow it's supposed to be into the 70s here, so getting closer to spring. Good permanent spring weather.
That's
I
good.
had a shandy for my lunch break beer, so that's why I gotta.
Oh, nice.
That was a light one, and then I'm gonna balance it with this heavy one.
Yeah.
I'm doing the opposite of Matt.
I have the Marzoni's Growler. This is their Brewer's Choice Idaho 7 IPA. So I got a growler refill on Monday from Marzoni's. Monday, it happens to be half price draft beer night, and I think it's $10 growler refills. So it's a pretty good deal to fill up the growler of beer. And so have a little bit of IPA. Idaho 7 IPA from Marzoni's.
This feels like that's going to be a West Coast IPA, I'm guessing.
It says American, and usually if it says American, that would mean West Coast because they'll usually say hazy on the other side. Yeah, it's not very hazy when I pour it.
So mine does not look like I have a golden stout. So I've got it smells like sort of like a peanut butter Oreo, a very heavy peanut butter. So we'll see.
That sounds delicious. Well, cheers.
Cheers. I gotta clean out
Cheers.
this fridge. It's there's too many beers in that fridge.
So your to-do list for the weekend is I don't want to drink as many beers. I just have to.
Ooh.
No.
My problem is I buy so it's beers and books are the exact same to me. I'm addicted to buying them. I'm not great at I read a lot, but I don't read as fast as I buy, and I don't drink as fast as I buy my beers. I'll go to the store and I'm like, oh, that looks like a really great 6-pack. Let me build my own 6-pack of these cool looking beers. I can't drink that fast. There's like a steady state of beers in the fridge and a steady state of books that I can't seem to get through.
How long do you let the beer sit in the fridge?
This has been in here a while.
Okay.
This so this feels like a wintry beer, right? Peanut butter fudge golden stout. I'm pretty sure if I think I know who gave this to me. I think a friend of mine when I left state college, I think he gave them to me when I left, which means that this is like at least a year and a half old.
No,
Still tastes good.
not all beers age like fine wine, do they?
No, but it tastes good. I like
All
it.
right.
It still tastes like a golden stout. So I don't know that it did not skunk on me.
All right.
That's good. So, Well, as we mentioned, we will be talking a little bit about higher interest rates and the impact. And I just learned that there's a phrase for this going around in internet world that Brian texted for us. That's an official phrase. So, Brian, do you want to share the phrase and what it means?
So when you're talking about monetary policy these days, the question is whether the Fed is going to leave interest rates higher for longer. So at the beginning of the year, the smart money was on the Fed cutting interest rates 6 or 7 times in the course of this calendar year. And as the year went on and inflation was remaining persistently high, people started to talk about whether or not the Fed might change its tune, or at least change the indications that it was going to try to cut interest rates at some point. And as more data came out, and the Fed kept saying, we're going to follow the data, we're going to follow the data. And the inflation rate hasn't been coming down. And so people have in the betting markets, the kind of the market mood has shifted away from that 6 or 7 interest rate cuts to then it was maybe 4, and now it's down to maybe 2 and maybe 1. And some people are even talking about maybe an increase before a decrease. But all of the exuberance of let's cut interest rates and we're past all this horrible inflation nonsense, that exuberance has gone away. And so the thought is that maybe the Fed's going to leave those interest rates high for a much longer period of time because they're not happy with the direction of the inflation numbers. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you saw what came out today. There was a pretty significant report that somebody called it the worst of all worlds today. So the inflation number. So the Fed has been looking at this thing called the what is it? The
PCE
consumption expenditures. Yeah, the PCE. And so that comes out around this time. It's not the same thing as the CPI. For some reason, the Fed prefers this measure. And that measure was up to 3.4%. And when you take the core of that, it was at 3.7%. So this was enough to cause people wailing and gnashing of teeth. Oh my gosh, inflation is still high. But then the bomb was the GDP number that came out was much, much lower than expected. So it's the horrible high inflation, low growth story of stagflation. So people are starting to throw that term around now. And so now macro is really, really great and really interesting. And people don't know what's going on. And that to me makes it a lot of fun to teach, at least. Maybe not to,
maybe not to
high
live
inflation and low growth, but.
And for context, so starting 2022, the federal funds rate was very close to zero. I'm looking at Fred, the data set. We'll put a link to that in the description. You can look through the chart. Very close to zero. Over the course of 2022, rose pretty dramatically to getting close to, it was almost over 4% by the end of the year, and has remained somewhat constant. It's remained somewhat similar, a little over 5% now. That's the number I see.
Yeah.
And the idea, the Federal Reserve, if they sense inflation, they'll raise interest rates to try to slow down the money in circulation. If they think the economy is doing poorly, though, they might try to pull back on interest rates to make money cheaper to borrow to try to stimulate economic activity. That for somebody who hasn't taught macro in a while, Brian, is that pretty good?
That's a pretty good summary. Yeah. They the Fed has a couple of tools. When is it? I think 2020. They stopped using the reserve ratio. So they, it used to be 10%. They said it's going to be 0. Don't worry about that one anymore. So they essentially took that out of the tool bag. They have the open market operations, which is the most common still. They can soup that up with quantitative easing. But lately, they've been using that federal funds rate, and then they also have a new interest rate. Well, it's not a new interest rate, but another interest rate that they will pay banks to put money on deposit at the Fed. So it's a tool that incentivizes banks to not lend as much if they raise that rate, and of course, increase lending if they decrease the rate at the Fed.
Yeah. And open market operations. And I know that there's some changes in the types of things they'll buy, but for those who aren't familiar, open market operations typically tell the Federal Reserve is buying or selling bonds.
Right. Yeah. Longer term government bonds.
In order to try to increase or decrease money supply and interest rates, simultaneously, essentially.
Mhm.
So interest rates have gone up, and it makes it. Where are a few spots where I have some things in mind where these are making an enormous impact that I think people know. Many of them might seem obvious, but the idea for new home buyers,
Mhm.
the impact is enormous, and not just for new home buyers, but home buyers who need to take out mortgages in general.
Yeah. Yeah.
The
So
impact is
this is one of the,
enormous.
yeah, I show my students this. And one of the things I ask my students at the beginning of a term is, what do you want to learn in an economics class? And this is especially important, I think, for the non-business major class that I teach. And they always say, I want to learn about the stock market. I want to learn about personal finance. I'm like, great, we're going to talk about some of that stuff. But when I show them what these higher interest rates mean for them buying a house, because some of these, I have seniors in this 1000 level class. They should have taken it years ago, but they put it off. They're going to be out in the real world very, very soon. And so I'll show them what these higher interest rates mean for them. So I give them a $300,000 house, which around where I live, that's a pretty nice house. I know in some parts of the country, that's not much, but
You can't even buy the land for that.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. $300,000 it can get a pretty nice house around here. So I say, all right, this is the interest rate that you paid before COVID. I give them just like 3.5%. I don't let them put any money down. And I say, this is what your payment's going to be over 30 years, every month for 30 years. And a 30-year mortgage on a $300,000 house at 3.5%, they're going to pay about $185,000 in interest over that time. And they kind of think, well, that's a lot, but it's 30 years. But then I show them with these new higher interest rates, and I bumped it up to 8% because they were, we were bordering on 8%, maybe 6 months or 8 months ago. That increases the price of their house by almost, let's see, a $300,000 house would cost them almost $800,000 at the end of 30-year mortgage. So they're paying almost $500,000 in interest as a result of those higher interest rates. And their heads explode. They just can't comprehend that much money and how much more. So I show them what their monthly payment is. The monthly payment's about $700 a month more.
Yeah,
The
I'm
same
I'm
house.
on Bankrate's mortgage calculator, and 300,000, 3.5, 1611 is what they say. And I'm going to update this to 8% and hit submit. And it is 2465. It is $850 more.
And they're not going to be making enough money
Mhm.
at their first jobs to afford that $300,000 house. So then the question is, all right, what do you do? What are your options at that point? And the options are, well, you buy a smaller house, or you don't buy a house. You rent, or maybe you live with your parents, or maybe
or you find renters, or
you find a roommate, and they don't like the
Roommates,
sound of that. They're like, I'm ready to get out of college. I don't want a roommate anymore. But so the interest rates and monetary policy is a really macro thing, but it's something that you can bring it down to the micro level, and let people see, what does this really mean for you if these rates stay higher for longer, and if there isn't if there aren't apartments, if there's a shortage of housing, you're not only going to see how much you pay go up because of the interest rate, but if the prices of houses across the board are going up, then you're not going to be able to afford a house till you're 50.
Yeah. For housing, I mean, the interest rates on the purchase of a home is crazy right now. The impact on that, it's not that far behind on cars either. And I mean, new car prices have gone up dramatically, and used car prices have gone up dramatically. And if you talked about a $30,000 car, each 1% interest is $300 a year. So if you have 4% higher interest rate, that's $1,200 on a $3,000 car, or an extra $100 a month just at interest. If you're going, if you're 4%, if you're a few percentage points higher, that adds up. I have seen, there was a TikTok that I don't know how to use TikTok. I actually have Econtastic has a TikTok account that Charlotte posts some of the stuff I do on, but I don't even know how to use TikTok. But there was one that showed up on Twitter or something about the average monthly car payment some people were making. And it was just stunning. And it was almost sickening of, I have $850 a month for something. Like, what?
Oh my gosh.
And
I
these
know
things-
I know which one you're talking about because I've seen that come across mine as well.
Oh, wow.
Like somebody's, $1,000 on my, personal finance advice. Yeah, don't invest a huge
Okay,
portion
but-
of your income on cars.
But
So
let me pick on the TikTok for a second because right, I'm not a macro person. Like I have bought and had I have recently bought and sold houses. So I've been trapped in this part, right? Of
You're
like,
trapped.
how do I sell a house whenever the interest rates are super high because nobody wants to buy it? And then buyers know that there's not that many buyers, and so they get real picky. But I think it echoes what Brian said, right? Like the car one I've seen because what it is it's people who are like, I have a 2023 Jeep something, it's $1,200. I have a 2024 car, and I'm like, they make perfectly fine cars that are 5 years old, that are significantly cheaper than what you're buying. So like in my mind, so that number shocks me, but mostly because I have an old car that I think actually a lot of econ professors do. They have like the oldest cars because they don't want to pay interest on stuff. And so, but I think it goes back to Brian's point, right? Is that there are alternatives. I guess where I get stuck. So I absolutely interest rates matter in the moment if you're thinking about buying a house or selling a house. But once you do, Matt, how long have you lived in your house?
This is 18 years.
Right? So like the moment you buy it, the interest rate really matters. And once you're locked in, for a large portion of people, it doesn't matter until you need to sell it again or buy it again. And so I guess that's where I get stuck in if we're at a higher interest rate for a longer period, it is absolutely going to affect anybody who wants to buy a house in the moment. And then it sort of, I think this is where we're essentially heading, is it sort of gums up and slows down the real estate market and people aren't buying and selling stuff. And so I get stuck on how important is it that it's high versus how important is it that it's going to be high for a long time?
Oh, that's a good question. So my sister lives in just right outside of Columbus, Ohio, and she lives in an older neighborhood. Her house it's a nice house, but it's smaller. It's probably from the 50s. And she's looking. They now have two kids. It got really small really quickly with those kids, and she told me what they could sell it for. I could not believe it.
Yeah.
And she said, what if they wanted a bigger house, what they would have to pay. There's no chance. There's absolutely no way they can afford to borrow money and to move into a bigger house because the market is such that the prices are all going up. So they're stuck where they are.
Yeah.
Unless they can find somebody who doesn't really understand the market. And then you have all these people like my parents and then younger who are in these enormous houses that they raise their families in. But if they sell them and leave, they can't get a mortgage rate that's any good. And so they have excess capacity in their house, but there's, financially, it doesn't make sense to sell, which really, like you're saying, Jadrian, really gums up the market in housing and makes it really hard for the people who are trying to get in.
Yeah.
Well,
If you're going to, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, you go.
If you're going to if you have a low mortgage now,
Yeah.
it's very, very tough for you to want to sell to get a new mortgage if you have to take a mortgage out. I mean, if you have if you have a mortgage and you have enough money where you can more or less pay cash for most or all, that's probably in my mind, that has to be the biggest impact of really distorting the real estate market.
Well,
right.
Okay, but here's where I'm going with this is have we been living in a period where we have had shockingly low interest rates where so I pulled I was Googling while y'all were talking, the 15-year mortgage rate history in the 90s, it was around 7-8%. And the sort of the 1990, it says, what is this? The 15-year average since 1991 was 5.19%.
My first mortgage was in grad school, and it was December 98, and it was 7%.
Right. And so I guess I look at it as, were we just really lucky and didn't this sucked, right? The switch from 3% to 8%, this for the people in this moment, this is awful. It is hitting them hard. But is this not the long run normal? It's almost like when we talk about the growth rate is 2%, right? We expect 2% long run over 100 years, but there's years that it's a lot and a little. And like, I guess it matters in the moment a lot for somebody in this period. But like, are we actually in a bad place if it's at whatever the long run average is?
Yeah, there was a lot
I'm
of
not a
talk
macroeconomist, so like,
well, there was a lot of talk in those circles, like monetary policy circles, about, oh, we've beaten the business cycle. Everything, is just going to be, rainbows and unicorns now from here on
Yeah.
out. That period of time when Greenspan was running the Fed and everything just seemed like it was so perfect. Long, interest rates for as far as the eye could see are going to be 1% or lower. But it's like, it's like Father Time always wins. It's like you always revert back to the mean,
mhm.
and you can have that, what do they call it? It's almost like money illusion, where you just don't understand what's really happening in the economy, because the numbers are kind of messed up, and they kind of mess with your brain a little bit. So you're the first person, though, Jadrian, that I've heard mention that concept of reverting back to that mean.
Yeah.
I think that's a really good point.
But it's painful, right? I mean, we spent 15 years.
I love it because
like,
I'm locked in. It's
right.
like 2.9%. I've thought about paying my mortgage off, but then I thought, well, why would I do that? Because with high interest rates, I could just keep the money in the bank, get a better interest rate on my savings, and the bank I'm repaying my mortgage to is getting negative interest rates from me.
You got arbitrage right now.
Absolutely.
And not pay back right now. And I mean, I think paying back made sense a few years ago, maybe. At least, there you could have, but right now, no. Can't. Not if you're at that. So quick thoughts, and I mean, I haven't formed them completely, so I'll try to sound coherent. But when we had I had a 3%, 3.5% interest rate. And that was, in ways, inflation was maybe 1% to 2% for much of the time, with a 3.5% interest rate. So I was paying 2% above inflation. Right now, the inflation rate is in the 3s. Mortgage rates are still closer to 7, though, right? The premium, the gap between the mortgage rate and the inflation rate is a bit higher, although I suspect a lot of that, right? Mortgages in general, I think, are a reasonably competitive market. There's a number of banks that will lend you mortgages. So I think that probably reflects some fear that we could have more inflation. I could be wrong. Brian, you're laughing. I know you are more relations to a bank than I do.
Right. So, and hi to all the guys on the Swickley Savings Bank board who promised to listen to the podcast. This is one of the things that we've been talking about a lot lately, because you're right. Like, the competition in this space is really, really fierce. So yeah, there's lots of places you can still borrow money. It's, just because the interest rates go up doesn't mean that eliminates the opportunity to borrow. And if you meet the criteria, our bank will lend to you.
Yeah. And so right now it appears bad. One part where I've thought these environments could be okay. So when I took out the mortgage at 7, I know I'll never pay more than 7%, but in a year or two, you might be able to pay less because you could refinance. And the big benefit of that is if these higher mortgage rates cause prices to drop, or at least cause prices not to increase, because traditionally home prices have increased 2 to 3% per year, you could imagine over a 30-year mortgage, over 30 years, somebody could be better off buying in a high interest environment if the price is depressed enough, because the price they're paying for the house is still the price they're paying for the house. And yes, for a year or two, they might pay this higher mortgage rate. But if things do revert back to that mean of a little bit lower than the 7% rate, they still got the house for a good deal, and now they get a slightly better interest rate if they can refinance in a year or two.
So you bring up something really interesting about locking in. So I'm not exactly sure how this all works, but in Canada, when you buy a house, everybody has an adjustable rate. It adjusts every 5 years. All mortgage rates adjust, and it kills people, because if they're in a house and they have to adjust their mortgage, that changes their budget, overnight. I mean, they all know it's coming, but it's still incredibly painful. So you can't lock in that lower interest rate for a long period of time. To me, that's not how we do it here. But it seems really peculiar that you can't get a long-term interest rate locked in. And I mean, it seems like there would be some business to be had if you started a company that lent to people in Canada and locked in for longer terms. They might be really, really happy to pay a slight premium just to buy a fixed mortgage rate.
Yeah. The UK, I know, has an adjustable rate scheme as well. I do not know the mechanics of how it works, but I have heard when it is incredibly popular, when the person comes on to announce, everything at the airport will stop and everybody will go to watch the TV because this is somebody saying how much richer or poorer they are about to become, which is like, part of me is I want to be at the airport when that happens.
So is the idea behind it that I never owned a home long enough to make refinancing make sense. Like I'd only ever owned one for like a couple of years. I mean, there's costs associated with refinancing in the sense of like, right? I mean, obviously the bank is losing out on all that interest. There's the paperwork aside of it too. Is the idea of sort of the automatic, we're going to adjust it anyway, is just sort of saying, you know what, we're going to avoid this whole mess of people locking in and then getting a new one and then refinancing maybe 10 years down the line, and just sort of saying we're treating everyone the same. You're all getting basically refinanced at either higher or low, hopefully, right, they hope lower, but possibly higher schemes. Like I'm curious, I guess it goes back to Matt's point earlier. You said sort of this part about maybe it actually could be a good idea to lock in at a higher interest rate because you could refinance later. And something you left out that I think is important is whenever there's higher interest rates, you have a lot more power as the buyer of the home. And so you might be able to get much better. You actually might be able to get the home cheaper than you normally would versus whenever it's super low and everyone's trying to buy because they're taking interest rates. I wonder if that's just sort of a way to prevent that sort of behavior of people rushing out to buy homes when it's really cheap and then not doing it whenever it's high and just sort of saying, you know what? We'll lock it in now. It's going to get changed in a couple of years anyway. And it just sort of maybe it smooths out the home buying process instead of our current version of it.
My guess is that would be a happy coincidence that
if it did.
Yeah.
I don't know that it does.
Yeah, right. There's probably some kind of, arcane British, statute somewhere that got carried over to Canada.
Yeah, that's probably more likely.
But now I want to look into this now. I'm curious about, why did they do that?
So the mortgages, I mean, I'm happy to keep talking about this. There's another area I always taught about in macro when talking about interest rates. Any more on mortgages before I change the topic?
I feel like there was something I was going to add, but I'll pass. I don't know enough. I don't.
No, I think honestly, I think we need to find somebody from Canada and the UK if we're going to understand those systems. It might be a fun episode to have a second one, and like how do mortgages work around the world? That could be a fun episode. But so when I was taught, I would always teach about how much businesses might invest in new products, in research and development, and how it would vary based on the interest rate. As it's kind of a standard macro concept. If the interest rates are high, right, a firm could just park their money and get 5% in interest rate return without having to try to do anything. Conversely, if they're going to start a new project, they better beat 5% by quite a bit. Whereas if the interest rate is 1% or 0.5%, boy, something that would have a rate of return of a few percentage higher still could be worth pursuing. And the interest rates could matter in when it makes sense to invest in new projects, invest in research and development. And so these higher interest rates, if they are real, and real interest rates, inflation adjusted interest rates, could slow down the economy. So Brian, it's been 7 years since I've taught macro. Is this something that comes up in your class?
Absolutely. Yeah. So okay. I like to think about interest rates. I mean, that's kind of the standard story. Businesses don't want to spend. They don't want to incur the costs if the interest rate's too high, because what if the project doesn't, meet expectations? And the problem for that is the long-term problem. So if businesses aren't investing today, then, a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years down the road, the economy isn't growing to what it, to the level that it could have been growing had the interest rates stayed low and businesses invested. And, job opportunities may be fewer than they would have been had companies been investing. But the government can't force you to invest, so you've got to do what makes sense from a profit perspective. And so there's that aspect of it. And if you want to bring it around to GDP, lower investment means slower economic growth. And maybe that's part of what we were seeing in the numbers that came out today. Consumption seems to be still pretty high. People are still willing to spend money. What surprises me, and I think this is where the inflation comes into it, is that because inflation is high, people are spending more. So from a nominal perspective, they have to spend more because everything's more expensive. So if you're spending more, it means you can't save as much. And one of the other stories with higher interest rates that's supposed to work out is that with higher interest rates, people should be incentivized to save more because the opportunity cost to spending goes up when the interest rates are high. But if inflation is also high, then you don't have as much money to save. And then if you don't have as much money to save, that interferes with the markets and the interest rate stays higher despite what the Fed wants. Yeah. There's so many moving parts in that loanable funds market. Again, it's sort of what really, I think, all those moving parts, it's like, all right, can I find which one is really the making the biggest difference? When I'm teaching this, I try to, I don't know if you've ever seen the DirecTV commercials, and maybe I'm jumping the gun a little bit on pop culture, but they ran this series of commercials that were so good about, here you're worried about your cable bill, and when you're worried about your cable bill, you don't sleep well, and when you don't sleep well, you do badly on the job, and when you do your job poorly, the gorilla escapes, and then somebody gets body slammed by a lowland gorilla. So it's like this chain of events. And like macro to me is just this chain of events that if the gorilla gets out, somebody's getting body slammed. And I think the gorilla getting out is a metaphor really for somebody at some point didn't understand interest rates, and then all of these side effects happen. It's fascinating. It's way more fascinating. Like I said, it's way more fascinating than I thought when I took my first macro class and was told macro doesn't exist.
You're being convinced to teach macro now, aren't you, Jadrian?
Okay, so I know I share the exact same sentiment with Brian. No, you're not going to get me in a principles of macro class unless I have to. I'm a labor economist, but I never really taught labor economics. I had taken it, and then I had to teach. I started teaching it because that's what my dissertation's in, and I just never realized how much macro I had to cover in a labor economics course. I was very naive to just all the, and we've talked about it on this podcast before, of just like all the stuff that comes from principles of macro. And Brian's exactly right. It is incredibly fascinating. And I think part of it too is I appreciate it because I'm older. Like I didn't care about the unemployment rate when I was 21. Like I was going to get a job. Like I'm different than the rest of the economy. Like it did not connect with me why I needed to care about any of the stuff that my macroeconomists were talking about. And now that I'm actually older, I think I appreciate it a lot more. No, I don't think you're going to get me in a principles of macro course, but it's fun to think about. I always go back to, and I think Brian actually did a really good thing that I want to highlight. Is like, what does it actually mean for the student? Because like that's the hardest part for me for macro is like, okay, what does it mean to a 20-year-old that the unemployment rate went up? Like, what can they do about it? And I think that's where you need to bring the micro stuff in of saying things like, look, there's more people competing for jobs and you need to set yourself apart and you need to signal that you're better. So like I try to weave that stuff in, but like I think the idea of like showing them, here's what it means for when interest rates are going up. Like it's this big of a change. What can you do differently to combat that? And then, how do you prepare? I think but at that point you're bringing micro into a macro course, which is probably why I like it.
Right. Well, it's like the showing the micro foundations of what. So whenever I started taking macro, and seriously, my teacher said there's no such thing as macro. We're just doing more micro here. And I think what he was trying to communicate to a bunch of naive, 18-year-olds, is that the macro that we experience is really built on all of these different micro stories. And if you try to separate the two, if you try to make macro something entirely different, you're not going to make a connection with the people in your classroom, for one thing. But it's it kind of disassociates that the big picture from what makes the big picture. It's like looking at a Matisse painting or some kind of impressionist painting where, again, here's another pop culture reference. Like in Ferris Bueller's Day Off, when Cameron's in the art museum and he's looking at that painting and he sees these like little dots and he's like looking, he just stares at this painting and it's all these little dots that make up this beautiful picture when you're far away from it. But when you look up close, it's just all these dots of paint. And that's the macro. The macro is the beautiful picture that you see, but it's all the little dots that make up that picture that's so important and vital. And for students, especially principal students, if they're not, if they don't understand that they are the dots that make up the macro, you're not gonna, I don't think you'll make an impression on them at all.
The second way, and I think it's a good point you made, like how does it all tie back? Second point I'd tie back on macro is a lot of the students will be in positions, they'll be in managerial positions, and the macro economy can have an enormous impact, right? If the unemployment rate is high and they're a hiring manager, they have their pickings of a lot of different really talented people, and they don't have to fight too hard to find the great talent. When the unemployment rate is where it is now, it gets a lot more difficult to find good talent. That's another way I might tie unemployment rate back. Interest rates, in some ways, I think it's a tougher one to get back. I mean, one way to tie it back might be to bring up the student loan debt, although I don't bring up student loans when I teach at all. So I'm like, yeah, that's something I'm staying away from. We have no power at Susquehanna University or any university to restrict what students do or do not do regarding student loans. But
I think there's a university, I think it's Indiana maybe, that students are required to sit through a student loan like program. I think sort of like Virginia Tech does it where like when they first start, they have to go through like an alcohol training and a sexual assault training. Like they have to do those. I think it's at Indiana. They require a course to basically show that exactly what Brian was showing. Hey, if you take this much in student loans, this is how much you're going to owe later. If you can take a little bit less, this is what you owe later.
Yep.
I don't know that. I mean, at the end of the day, they can take whatever they want. Brian, I actually have another question for you. I'm gonna expand on your small dot and a big dot picture. You earlier said the S word, and I want to talk about it because stagflation is fascinating, and that explains a decade's worth of data. However, people are dropping that word for 1/4 of data that has had below 2% GDP change.
Mm-hmm.
And an inflation rate that is higher than what we're used to, but not even close to what the inflation rates were during stagflation,
or even 2 years ago,
or even 2 years ago, right? Like,
yeah,
so I guess is that a fair thing for people to say that this is like the start of that? Just feels so reactionary that like, but I know that that's going to pick up steam. Like that, those are the sort of things that like. When it comes to macro like those are the things that cause like what is it? I don't know the phrase, right? There's a phrase, right, where it's the you said exuberance earlier. Maybe it's in that space too, right? Where when people think there's a recession, they're going to change their behavior, and then they create a recession because they think there's a recession.
Right.
What's that called?
Right.
What that's a thing, right?
Self-fulfilling prophecy.
Oh, I thought it had like a special macro term. But so like, is it fair? Is it really fair to say that like this is the start of stagflation because the Q1 GDP was 1.6% for this year?
So the easy answer is no, it's not fair.
Okay.
But somebody, if enough people say it,
I did Google it, right? Like people are saying it, which is
totally,
which is annoying.
But the reason, I think the reason is because somebody wants to be the person to say, I called the stagflation. I said it first.
Yeah.
Hey, remember 6 months ago when I said stagflation? Everybody pay attention to me. And that's the problem with, we think politicians are have this, have captured this kind of 24-hour news cycle and they just want to be in front of a camera, but economists can do it too.
Yeah. I think this was a thing in Think Like a Freak, right? That nobody remembers when you're wrong. So like if you stand up and yell that this is the start of stagflation, everybody's just going to forget you.
Mm-hmm.
No, like I'm looking at the GDP. I mean, Matt and I had this conversation last year when we were trying to figure out if 2022 was a recession or not.
Oh yeah, that was a good episode.
Right, like, and I don't agree with Matt. Matt thinks it was a recession.
Might be our biggest disagreement, sadly.
No, I think there's probably got to be
macro question, and you guys can't agree.
It's a great, it's a great question, right? Like everything we've ever taught was two consecutive quarters. that was 2 consecutive quarters, and then they moved the goalpost and said, no, never mind, it's not that. But then I would also argue that the COVID recession was not 2 consecutive quarters, and we called that a recession.
Right.
And so like, I don't know. I'm looking at GDP growth over since Q3 of 2023. It's around 2%. Like, I don't know. It's like, I don't call that low growth. Like, that's not 2% the average.
Well, it's like stagflation technically should be negative growth. We haven't had that yet. It should be negative growth.
Unless
with
2022, right?
Yeah, but this quarter it wasn't negative.
No,
So
Or we should see a
jumping on
spike
the-
or a spike in unemployment rates too.
Right.
Yeah.
So you
know, if one of the two.
I pulled up Fred to look because I was very curious. I mean, there was like in the 70s, just like in 74 and 75, there was like 3 or 4 quarters of negative growth. Like,
Mhm.
I don't. So I get personal is not the right word. I don't like that. I don't like that sort of analogy. I think it's unfair. The reason I bring up the unfair part is that the people who had to go through that in the 70s were going through some like real serious things because of what was happening. And like, while this is annoying, that this is not as bad as what people were going through when inflation rates were like 12% or whatever. Like, it's sort of like
12, unemployment 7, 8, 9. Yeah,
like those were bad times, and like this sucks. It wasn't that. Like, and it feels so unfair. And I think this popped up last year when people were like, we're living in a second Great Depression. And I'm just like, you got to be kidding me. People were living in like Hoovervilles. Like people were dying like because of the policies that were in place. Like, yes, it's bad. It's not that bad. And I always just get so frustrated when they make those sort of comparisons. Because like I think it feels like it ignores like real pain that those people went through in that decade.
Could we be at the beginning of a potential stagflation? We could be. Is it way too early to say we are? Yes.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
It's
maybe I'll say it's irresponsible to be saying things like that whenever we've had 6 consecutive quarters of growth. Inflation should be, I wish inflation was lower. It's not. And actually, maybe this goes back. Maybe we'll tie in one more macro thing, I guess, in this long-term part. One of the big things with inflation is this idea, and I think, Matt, actually, you said it, is this idea of expected inflation is tied in there of what I think it's going to be like in the future. And I wonder if some of this stickiness of the Fed not being able to get inflation down where they want is for the past 2 years, past year or so, we've been saying, well, they're going to cut it soon. It's coming, like, we're going to cut it a lot. And so it's just the idea that like people are like, well, I'll go ahead and get a mortgage now. They're going to cut it in next year. And then at this point, they're like, okay, maybe we need to change their expectations. And then that actually will be the thing that kicks them into stopping what they're doing and then getting inflation down. Is that possible? I don't know. I'm not a macroeconomist, but expected inflation was always an interesting idea to me.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Or am I a microeconomist saying too many macro words?
No, expectations are enormous. And this is one of the reasons why the Fed wants to, really, like a laser focus on getting that inflation down, because if expectations do change, then that's got the potential to keep that inflation rate higher. Because now if you expect inflation to stay at 3.5%, that means next time you're up for a raise, well, I need to get paid more.
Yeah.
And that keeps that, higher inflation is not anything that anybody wants to be dealing with, because it's really, really hard to get it to come down once expectations settle in at a higher rate.
And a lot of economists thought there was a chance that unemployment rates would go up when we cut inflation from the 8%. And I thought they might go up too, because they always have in the past, for the exact reason, Brian, that you mentioned, right? The expectations are higher, so I need this higher raise. Well, the higher raise means the firm is poorer and they can't hire as many, and they lay people off, and that pushes the unemployment rate up. One thing I hope economists learned in the last couple of years, myself included, is that if the inflation rises suddenly, the expectations don't necessarily adjust immediately, because we did not see the big spike in unemployment that we always had seen. And I don't think anybody who thought, I bet unemployment will go up when we cut this, I do not think they were unreasonable at all to think that, because that had been what had happened in the past
Well,
but
that
I
was the
don't think
great fear. Yeah, that was the great fear, the talk about the soft landing. Can the Fed engineer a soft landing, or is it going to be like all the other times in the past when they try to cut inflation, it slows economic growth and then people lose their jobs. But coming out of, everything is so unique in macro too, because you're coming out of a pandemic this time. We haven't had that series of events before. So, so many people would quit work and the labor force participation rate had dropped so much that, it lowering or raising the unemployment rate was going to really be difficult unless unless interest rates were 40% or something crazy.
Yeah. Well, any final words of wisdom on this before we hop to the pop culture?
I've got my pop culture. I've already got it locked in.
All right.
That seems
I'm
to be a
ready.
sign that Jadrian, you should go first.
I'll go first. We're talking about stagflation and inflate. I think there's one song that is the perfect song for the 1970s and inflation, and that is Billy Paul's "Let the Dollar Circulate," which talks about the idea like we need to get money moving and help people. And there's good lines. I have the lines pulled out. Things are getting higher, makes it harder on the buyers. Unemployment is on the rise. So he talks about the recession, the 73 to 75 recession. So it's on Econ Media Library, but I'll put it in the show notes. It's also
Very
a fun
cool.
song. It's a very good song
I
to
don't
listen
know
to.
that I've heard that song. So
you have?
You're gonna like. I'm surprised. This is
Wow.
It's a good song.
okay.
It's got like 1970s funk is what it is. Like I don't think that's probably the right genre, but like that's what I'm gonna call it.
Yeah,
So.
that's fantastic. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Brian, you hinted at one earlier.
Yeah.
Pop culture reference.
I'll go with something a little different.
Is there not a
this
superhero example that
superheroes
you
and
could use?
inflation? There's probably something from the 70s where they're fighting some evil inflation monster. That's an enormous hole in my comic book resume. But there was this episode of The Simpsons. This probably fits better with fiscal policy, but I think it's still really interesting where somehow Mr. Burns got a hold of the world's only $1 trillion bill. And so he had it under lock and key, and he was getting sick of all the rules and regulations in the United States. So he takes a flight and he's going to go to the bastion of freedom, which is Cuba, because he doesn't understand that Cuba has become this communist dictatorship. And they cut away, and there's Fidel Castro talking to his inner circle, and they say, yeah, this communism thing never would have worked anyway. So it's time to give it up. And Burns lands in Cuba with this $1 trillion bill, and Castro asks to see it, and then he never gives it back. And so the communism continues on in Cuba because Mr. Burns gave him this $1 trillion bill. So now they have money. It's like the money supply has all of a sudden increased, and the hope is that this is going to stimulate the economy in Cuba.
Interesting. I haven't seen that either, so I'll need.
It's one of the older ones. Back I'll say when The Simpsons was really good.
Yeah.
I'll try to find it and see if I can put it on the Econ Media Library.
Yeah, I'll send you. I've got
Okay.
I've got that.
One I have is
give it a second.
season somewhat related, but season 5 of Game of Thrones. Mace Tyrell is they're discussing the ethics of charging interest on loans. So we didn't really get into the ethics of interest and stuff, which is kind of a separate topic. But yeah, it's interest rates, so I figure it's related enough. They were noting how like higher interest rates are seen by distasteful as some, but hey, people wanted them, but the interest built Bravos, right? Like it's the Iron Bank of Bravos in this kind of beautiful area. And it's just kind of an interesting thing to think throughout history. The idea that we have mortgages that charge interest, and that's normal. But historically, there have been times where charging interest was viewed as repugnant and not allowed. And it ties back to somebody we have talked about a fair amount on this podcast, which is Al Roth and Nobel Prize.
You said repugnant market. That's what I was.
Repugnant markets. And so it's kind of an interesting thing to tie in how the interest. What would the world have looked like if people thought charging interest was not okay? That it's so repugnant, it just shouldn't be allowed. It should be banned. How different would civilization how much poorer would we really be all be today if that were the case? So something kind of fun to think about through a Game of Thrones clip. Jadrian, Brian, wonderful to see you both and chit chat a bit. Brian, thanks for joining us again. Is this the fourth time you've been on? Third time? Fourth time?
I think it's the third.
Yeah, third time. Certainly appreciate it and the nudge on the interesting topic. And a reminder for listeners, we've mentioned it before, but Jadrian and I will be at Sea Tree in Atlanta. If you are interested in jumping on, we would love to have you on. Send us a note. We will be finding a brewery. Or the first time we did these live, Brian, you just came and grabbed a drink and watched us talk to some other folks for a while and laughed hysterically when I mentioned how I went to Barbie and they made me dress as Ken. I remember that. But
maybe we need to actually sit down and plan where we're going to be so that if anybody does just want to watch the live version of it, they can.
That I think maybe that's for our next episode. Maybe we'll have an announcement for that. So. But
yeah, you get to perform in front of a live studio audience. What's better than that?
Be a lot of fun, maybe, or terrifying, or both. So, well, until next time, it's wonderful to talk to you both. Cheers.
Yep. Cheers.
Thanks, guys.